Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 136, and we're going to talk about costly affordable housing. Um, so, recently I saw an article about affordable housing in LA that costs in the neighborhood of $600,000. And then I remembered that a few years ago, I saw an article about San Francisco and how they had just completed affordable housing, and it cost $750,000 per unit to build, and that was in 2020. And then, in my little 5-minute Google search, I found that the LA Times reported that California now regularly spends over $1 million per apartment to build for affordable housing. So that kind of is interesting, right? So you're building affordable housing for homeless people, but they cost $1 million. So what part of that is affordable for whom? So you have that situation. Now you might say, well, that's because these are brick and mortar affordable housing things, right? And you would be right. LA realized that these buildings take too long to build, they're too expensive, so they're just going to provide tents for homeless people, right? Why not? Tents. These are simple, right? $10 a pop, perhaps. Well, they provided tents for homeless people in this parking lot, and it was $44,000 per tent. Now, you might be appalled and flabbergasted by that figure, but keep in mind that it's not just the tent. You got to take into consideration the bed and all of the other things that are included in each tent. Then you have to also provide sanitary facilities, bathrooms, but you're not going to just be porta potties. I mean, they have to be able to bathe, they need sinks and stuff, and so they built, I'm sure, bathroom facilities for them. Then you need facilities for the staff who's going to oversee all of the catering that you are providing for everyone who's living in this homeless shelter, right? And so that's what adds up to 44,000 per tent per year. Now you might be saying, where's the real estate that they're building these tents, pitching these tents, excuse me? It'll be on a parking lot, as I said before, but a parking lot that will later become public housing, right? So the parking lot will later be demoed and they would put up public housing there anyway. So why not use it for homeless people in the meantime? But why isn't the public housing being constructed now? Well, because it'll be years for the construction to actually begin. Why years? Because that's how much red tape there is, right? You have to, jump through all of these hoops before you even can start the building. All right. So why is affordable housing so expensive? Well, that's the first reason. So many codes to abide by, so many regulations that you must submit to, and collectively, it's very expensive. I mean, can you imagine submitting a plan to build, I don't know, let's call it a 15-story affordable housing complex, okay? But now you got to wait 3 years before you even begin. Well, you are sitting on that real estate, you're paying taxes on that real estate, and you can't even begin construction on that real estate. So, uh, right off the bat, it's very expensive, right? You're losing money. Now, it's not that you're going to build an unsafe building, right? See, that would be bad for you, your construction company, your reputation. So you're obviously going to build a nice, affordable housing, structure, but you have to build it to code. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of the codes that exist, what is required, uh, include which companies you're supposed to use, right? And so all of this turns into a kind of, maybe use the word scam, I don't know, where all of these people are in line waiting to get the contracts that they know are coming because they are required to be used for this building project. Think about it. How safe can you make a tent? How unsafe were buildings 100 years ago before there were all these building codes and regulations? And we know that they're pretty good. They were pretty well built in spite of the fact there were no codes and regulations. And so, even if you use those building standards, the buildings won't be unsafe, right? They probably won't be as luxurious as they are now with all of these codes and regulations. But there it is, right? We're trying to build affordable housing. Another reason why they're so expensive is because you need to use union labor, right? You can't use the contractor of choice. You have to use union labor, as if union labor is better. Sometimes they are, I guess, but sometimes they're not. They are always very expensive, right? Because they're in the union, they automatically have a price floor. They charge a certain amount per hour because they're union workers. My university built a new building. This was years ago, but they didn't use union labor. And so the union workers protested the construction, and every day they were protesting the construction. They would circle the campus and particularly the block where the building was going up with a large speaker on the roof, basically saying that the university should be ashamed that they're using non-union labor for substandard work, whatever. And the building was actually quite nice. And funnily enough, union labor was hired to build this other building, a new science, state-of-the-art building. And there were construction accidents during the whole thing. So that was pretty hilarious, right? So union labor does not guarantee a certain level of quality. It just guarantees that it'll be a lot more expensive. Okay, not all union labor is bad, but I'm just saying it's going to be more expensive. And that's why the prices are so high to build this affordable housing. Now, why use union labor? Well, because all the politicians need to get union, what do you call it, support during election time. And in exchange, then you have to promise to send work their way. I mean, you can be in a union, but if you never get any work because you're so expensive, well, then it doesn't matter how much you're charging per hour, you're not going to get any work. So you have to guarantee that they will always have work so they can make a lot of money. There were a lot of union workers apparently that make double, triple what college professors were making. Not that they didn't deserve it, but they would laugh at intellectuals for for going to school so long, having so much debt when they're already living extremely comfortably, even by the time they're 30 years old. So anyway, they have these guaranteed contracts, and they have no incentive of working quickly, right? So even if they drag their feet out, well, they still get to charge for their time, and so they're continually paid. So all of these things contribute to the extremely high cost of building affordable housing in the city. And there's a lot more to that. I'm just going over it very briefly. And if you're interested, you can do more research if you want. But this situation reminded me of a book that we had to teach once in a while, and that was Jane Jacobs's Death and Life of Great American Cities, which was originally published in 1961. Now, she's a city planner and, supposedly a more liberal, perhaps, city planner, a more compassionate city planner. And so in the book, she at the same time critiques the previous city planning methodology, approach, mentality, and then proposes a different one instead. And as she's starting the book, she's basically says that one of the biggest complaints that she has of slums, the inner city, these slums, these low income housing projects, right, is that people are leaving the slums too quickly. And I asked students what they thought of what that meant, and they were stumped, obviously, because no one ever really taught them to think critically. But think about it. If the so-called slums, this is basically low-income housing. When you go bankrupt, when times get hard, you have to move into the slum, but within 9 months, you're out of the slum. What does that mean? You're able to get back on your feet very quickly. The hard time is very short. And so the economy was such that you could build your life, put your life back together reasonably quickly. And so her complaint was that, oh, these people, they're not staying long enough to change this slum into a very nice neighborhood. So how do we incentivize all of these people to stay, right? And so that's her mindset, right? These so-called slums, we can turn them into something not slums, and in order to do that, we have to incentivize people to stay somehow. And, she builds up her whole argument based on her understanding of a sidewalk, right? The importance of the sidewalk to an urban setting, and why sidewalks are not good in a business district because you don't get this foot traffic all day long, but you get that in a residential area. So this is what's really, really good. So anyway, so sidewalk. And, if you prefer to live in the city where you have very little privacy, or you like to live in the suburbs, where you have lots of privacy, she doesn't care, right? Living in the city obviously is where it's at. You want people to know what everyone else is up to because, safety is more important than privacy, right? Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but it is this sort of refrain that you always hear from authoritarians. Now, I'm not saying that San Francisco and LA today are the result of Jane Jacobs, but it is a kind of city planning that results in that kind of result. But I am saying that Toronto in Canada is the result of Jane Jacobs. Now, uh, Toronto is very interesting. Some of you may know that Toronto is a very wealthy city. And then if you add to that, that Jane Jacobs is the one that helped and assisted, and the city was developed according to Jane Jacobs's guidelines and suggestions, you might say, whoa, her ideas actually work, right? So it was very interesting. I had one student who had relatives in Toronto, and so he went to visit, and he said he spent the whole day, uh, you know, walking around the city trying to find a slum. So he heard that the city doesn't have any slums, and he's like, this is all probably city propaganda. So he didn't ride the subway or the whatever, the public transportation, and went to all of the places where public transportation normally doesn't go, looking for a slum. And he said he spent 7 days looking for a slum. He couldn't find one. So therefore, Jane Jacobs's ideas, contrary to my opinions, she's awesome. She's a wonderful person because there are no slums. And then the same semester, but in a different class, I had someone who also had relatives who lived near Toronto. Okay. And she also said, yeah, Toronto is a beautiful city. And I said, oh, where did your relatives live? And she said, not in Toronto. And I said, but no, but you said you went to Toronto. She goes, yeah. We had to go into the city. And I said, so where do your relatives live? And she said, oh, just outside the city. And I said, oh, so just outside the city, does it look as nice as Toronto? And she said, no. And that's when it hit them. They so regulate everything in Toronto within the city limits that they pushed all of the slums out. And so Jane Jacobs doesn't really get rid of slums, right? She doesn't eradicate the problem of homelessness and low income housing, or even just the moniker slum. No, she just relocates them outside of the city so she can have her perfect city and be blind to all of the low income housing that she pushed outside of the city. It was hilarious, right? So, you can't get rid of slums. You can't get rid of low income housing. And when you have authoritarians try to tell you how to, understand and therefore solve this problem, you're just going to have worse problems, right? And I would even go so far as to say that the so-called slums of the early 1960s are nothing like the certain inner city areas that we see today. You cannot compare them, right? You don't have trash everywhere. You don't have people trashing their living space the way that you see it today. It's not the same, but we use the same word, right? And there's that interpretive drift that I mentioned before, right? So we're using the same word, but what they're used to designate what they are just what they are attached to has completely changed. Okay. Now, that's what happens in an authoritarian situation. You either have really expensive so-called affordable housing, where only the few chosen get to live there. In fact, it incentivizes people to become homeless so they can live in one of these $1 million apartments in a city that's really, where the real estate is extremely high, or you push all the slums outside of the city. But you're not going to get rid of them. You're not going to get rid of low income housing or low income people. They're always going to be there. So what if there were no regulations? Then what would happen? Then people would buy and sell their property as needed, right? And they would gravitate to those areas which make the most sense. If real estate to rise, right, price of housing, apartment complexes, or whatever, well, the cure for high prices is high prices. More people are going to build. And so you can't build a high-rise apartment complex because of all the zoning regulations to prevent you from bringing down real estate costs by building a nice high-rise apartment complex, right? Making more units available for people to purchase. And so you increase supply. And when supply is increased, demand is satisfied, and so prices come down. So basically, without all of these regulations, which restrict the building and restrict how you build and control how you build, well, now you can build more affordable housing. Plus, because everything is now, property that is bought and sold, people are going to build where it makes most sense. You're not going to build on flood prone areas. People build on flood prone areas because it's cheap, right? And so you're required to put in certain safeguards so that even if you do have flooding, the houses themselves won't flood, but they always do, because they take the average rainfall. They don't look at the catastrophic levels of rainfall and figure that in. They're never going to do that. And that's why you have some of the disasters that you see. The buildings are not built according to what is needed, but according to code. And whatever is code is not necessarily established with natural disaster in mind. And we talked about this before. So, areas that make the most sense for housing, that's what's used. And whatever is not good for housing, they can become your bird sanctuaries, your open spaces that you always want to, have for your kids or whatever. If you want a park, you can, buy all this real estate and turn it into a park, or you're going to have, it becomes to that idea of who would build the roads? Well, who would build the parks? Well, obviously, if you are a large corporation and you know that mental health for your workers is really important, you can build a park for your workers, right? And I think, out where I live, there are a couple parks that are private, right, but are open to the public, right? And it's mostly made for their workers, right? So they have a place to relax, to chill, to eat their lunch, whatever. And so businesses, instead of having to build affordable housing, they can, have a public park, a private public park, public private park, or something like that. And so it's the regulations which create a lot of the housing problems, right? Makes them in short supply, which drives up their price, their cost. No competition for labor means that you have to use union labor, which is very expensive, which also drives up the cost. With all these regulations, innovation becomes really difficult, especially when it comes to fast building. And if you ever have a chance, I should do an episode on fast building, but building a 50-story building in 19 days where everything is already working, right? And it's all about prefabrication, right? You make the parts in another location and you stick them all together like Lego. But there's a time-lapse video of a 53-story building being built in 19 days. Incredible. But no, you can't do that here in America because of all the regulations and all the codes. And so you can't bring down the price, right? Because there are too many people who only want to make money the old way, the old slow way, right? So imagine if there were no regulations, then you can build anywhere you want it according to need, and the price of the housing would be extremely affordable all of the time. And that's it for this episode. I hope you learned something that you didn't know before, and I'll talk to you next time.